word quantum is used in all contexts. It's becoming synonymous with magic. So physicists are a bit fed up. And as soon as someone talks about quantum in an alternative human field, etc., they say it's nonsense. They're not wrong because there's abuse on both sides. In fact, there's an excessive rejection on the scientific side, and there is excessive acceptance from the general public, alternative therapy, etc. Many jobs will disappear, but these are jobs that are not particularly useful. In my opinion, it will be positive. It is important that humanity finally learns a lesson via AI. That is to say, we are in a paradigm that is false. We are in a paradigm where we confuse language and thought, where we think that consciousness arises from brain activity, etc. We are materialists, we are physicalists, and that is what has led us into the current wall. Bernardo Kastrup, through his model of analytical idealism, provides us with absolutely fabulous arguments to show us that we are in a confusion. And due to this confusion, from physicalism or materialism, we confuse reality perceived with fundamental reality. And it is this confusion that leads us to make a second mistake, which is believing that consciousness is produced by the brain.
Philippe Guillemant.
Hello.
We are very happy to have you on the Antithese channel. Before we begin, I briefly remind our listeners not to forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and activate the bell to not miss any updates. It's free and helps us a lot. Follow us also on our other channels, Instagram, TikTok, Spotify. Thank you very much for your support. Now, Philippe Guillemant, could you briefly introduce yourself?
So, I am a physicist engineer. I spent almost my entire career at the CNRS. The majority of my career has been dedicated to technology. I developed several innovative systems and created two technology companies around computer vision and artificial intelligence. And I also conducted research in three fields: neurosciences, artificial intelligence, and towards the end of my career, theoretical physics.
And today, you are a writer, an author, you write books.
Today, I am recently retired from the National Center for Scientific Research. It had already been more than 10 years, even more than 15 years, that I had started writing books. In connection with my research, since my research in theoretical physics focused on the characterization of what could be called the multiverse of a billiard. It was about pushing calculations to the limits to show that what is called chaos is something that ultimately can become quantum reality. That's it.
I think that insiders won't understand all of this, but I believe we will also indeed expand on this during the interview. For those who follow us, this is the second time we are having you at our place. Thank you for accepting our invitation again. In the previous show, we were talking about artificial intelligence. In light of recent progress, what has happened over the past year and a half, what can you say about this topic today?
What is new is that I had the opportunity to test different AIs, ChatGPT, Grok, Perplexity, and recently DeepSeek. Impressive indeed, DeepSeek. And well, having already worked in artificial intelligence, I wasn't too surprised, though still fascinated by how natural language usage.
The LLM, is that it? The large language model.
Yes, exactly. It's very powerful, but one shouldn't fall into the myth Artificial intelligence seems to be intelligent, undeniably, but it's the intelligence of the mind, the intelligence of words. There is a risk of confusion between words and thought. That is also a societal problem because academically, I would say we almost maintain this confusion.
What exactly do you mean by the confusion between words and thoughts?
Reducing thought to language is something extremely reductive and makes us forget the essence of true intelligence, which is the ability to make choices. Because true intelligence, by definition, is intelligence linked to the faculty of adaptability. Who says adaptability means the ability to make the best choices, but no artificial intelligence? It is not capable of making choices. In fact, that is exactly what I wanted to tell you. Having tested different types of AI, we realized that AI is perfect for providing us with the different possible interpretations, the different possible choices, but in no way does AI make choices. It might tell you that such a viewpoint is the most consensual and that another viewpoint is marginal, but it will not take a position. So, of course, we can develop algorithms lead the artificial intelligence to take a position, but it is from that moment that it becomes dangerous. What does that mean? It means that we have the impression that the intelligence is making choices, but these choices are actually made by the rules dictated at the algorithm level. That is to say that what is valuable in AI is its ability to perform impressive data mining that will cover everything thought about on the web and deliver to us the different possible points of view on a reality, on different facts. And that's good. On the other hand, if we start using AI to make decisions, that's where it goes wrong. Because a decision is necessarily based on something that involves the right brain, not the left, which has an emotional aspect, a vibrational aspect. And there, AI is not incapable of making such choices. If it does, it is purely artificial and becomes dangerous because in reality, an AI cannot make a choice. A choice is something that requires having consciousness. AIs do not have consciousness. They do not have a vibrational structure that allows them to make choices, but we can, despite everything, indeed using algorithms to decide to use AI as a control system. That's where there is danger. That is to say, if we delve too much into the mystification that comes from being fascinated by the apparent intelligence of AI, I specify it's the intelligence of the mind. It's not the totality of intelligence. We risk to fall into the trap of accepting the decisions of AI. In no case are these decisions directly linked to AI. These decisions are related to rules that are dictated by humans. So caution is necessary. One should not use AI to make choices. One should use AI to learn all perspectives. It's linked to different paths. It's linked to the difference between consciousness and brain activity. Brain activity is deterministic, whereas consciousness is open to different paths.
Many people are not aware that these LLMs, these models behind ChatGPT, Grok, and others are simply mathematical probabilities, and a probability that with an input sentence posed in the machine, the best result is this one.
The best result is this one. Yes, the impressive nature of AI lies in the fact that these are essentially statistical algorithms. you will be able to bring out what is most relevant. I have developed this kind of algorithm myself in my career, and I know how impressive it can be. Around the 2000s, I developed artificial intelligence algorithms that impressed various companies like Thales, like Logitech, etc. I myself was impressed by the power of my artificial vision algorithms. Already at that time, but in no way I attributed to them a potential related to consciousness. Back then it was easier. Today we fall into the trap more easily.
What role do you think humans can take? So indeed, you talked about choices, you talked about ultimately controlling the outcome, but many are questioning, with the disappearance of certain jobs, journalists, for example, might no longer need to write articles themselves. How do you think this will evolve in the future?
I'm not worried about that. Yes, there are plenty of jobs that will disappear, but they are jobs that are not really useful. And it will be, in my opinion, positive. How to say? Of course, if we look at the consequences in terms of employment, etc., but let's try to take a step back. It is important that humanity, in the end, undergoes a lesson via artificial intelligence. That is to say, we are in a paradigm that is false. We are in a paradigm where we confuse language with thought, where we think that consciousness comes from brain activity, etc. We are materialistic, we are physicalists, and that is what has led us to a dead end. It is the cause of the collapse of society. We can try to find other causes, but if we look for the cause of causes, it's the mind. It's having bet everything that it is essentially the West. It is the West that is concerned. It is the physicalist thought, it is the materialist thought of the West that is the cause of causes of the collapse. And so we are going to receive lessons from AI because AI will bring us something very useful. But since we have not understood what the mind is and the fundamental limitation of the mind, that is to say, the mind, meaning analytical intelligence, is not an intelligence that should lead us to make choices, to make decisions. Otherwise, we stray from humanity. Humanity is something else. Humans also have vibrational intelligence and emotional intelligence, and that is the source of true intelligence. These are the emotions. No, not the emotions. These are the feelings. It is all that concerns. It is all within the realm of consciousness. It is love. It is joy. These are what dictate choices in life. It is our vibrational state. That is, if when faced with an event, we have a choice to make, the choice will not be the same if it is made. An equivalent mental choice will not be the same if it is made by a person who is afraid or by a person who has confidence. We saw it during COVID in particular. Confidence and fear with equivalent mental capacity will lead to different choices. So we see that choices are not linked to the mind, but attempts are made to make us believe otherwise. The desire to control us is ultimately trying to be a bit of this mystification, this belief that intelligence can be based on algorithms, and even that it could give consciousness to algorithms, which is completely delusional. But still we fall, people, well, the public, the ordinary person tends to fall into the trap and eventually accept that those who seem smarter than it bring about the decision to be made. That's where we'll fall into a trap. There's another aspect, which is that artificial intelligence, it bases its results, everything it gives us, about the massive data set that is the web. Now, this massive data set that is the web, with AI, it will increasingly be founded by AI itself. That is to say, when you ask a question to AI, many people use it to make a report. This report ends up on the web. It is difficult to know what proportion of this report is of artificial origin or human origin. Often it's mixed, so an artificial intelligence will have a hard time saying this is content that was created by a human or not. Also, it would require too much computing power to try to find out what has really been computed by an artificial intelligence. And so the AI will fall into the trap of ending up with the information it itself produced to create the information it will deliver. And so this will create degeneration.
That is to say, the content will be less and less precise, qualitative.
The content will be less and less human and more artificial. And that will cause, we will have a vicious circle there, and it will cause a degeneration of artificial intelligence. Several people have already, I think even Musk himself, have already warned of this risk. I think we need to go through this.
You were talking about decision-making related to AI. Have you seen The Sum of All Fears?
The Sum of All Fears.
Film from the 2000s with the nuclear apocalypse.
It's a movie, right? I think so. I don't know if I've seen it. I think I haven't seen it.
The American population is saved because one person decides at a certain moment not to trigger the nuclear strike. Do you think that this kind of scenario could happen?
If we let a machine learning algorithm make the decision, yes, it could happen, of course. Since, in fact, there you are giving an example of a situation where, in the end, the planet is saved by an irrational act, which will easily be deemed irrational. An AI will not commit an irrational act. The only way to make an AI perform an irrational act is to rely on chance. But there is no randomness in AI. There is a necessity to integrate randomness into AI, but to exonerate developers, to exonerate because there is an issue of responsibility. I often give the example of AI driving an autonomous car and who finds himself facing a lady who, with her pram, is crossing the road. And then, on the other side, there is a car approaching. What choice will it make? And here, we have a problem which is even more acute, since the autonomous car is perfectly capable of recognizing what is happening. Because there is a choice that is, and so the engineers discuss very seriously the need to use randomness in such a way that the choice is not made by an algorithm. It clearly shows that AI has a problem as soon as there is a need for a choice.
A moral choice, by the way.
A moral choice. There it is. So an AI is not capable of making moral choices. Therefore, it is very important to remember that. AI is not made to make choices. AI enters the inhuman realm from the moment we allow it to make choices, from the moment we add algorithms which lead to choices. So the population must pay very close attention to that. AI is something fantastic. It's extremely useful. But by the way, when using AIs, you can see that they give you several possible answers. If it gives you one answer, you just need to slightly change your tone, and it quickly changes its mind. So we can clearly see that in the end, we can make an AI say anything, just like we can make a very intelligent person who is only in the mental realm say anything. Because ultimately AI will simply simulate the human mind. But the mind is not intelligence. Intelligence is the ability to adapt. The ability to adapt relies on the ability to make choices. And this is not analytical. This is of a nature vibrational, emotional, conscious. And AI has no consciousness.
We talked about various topics in our first interview on our channel, so I refer listeners to that for all the themes we won't cover today. But there is still a topic that is dear to you and that we haven't developed much yet, which is synchronicities. So, how do you define a synchronicity? First question.
So, synchronicity is a concept that was invented by Jung. The word itself, synchronicity, I believe, which he defined as the convergence of two events that are without a link of causality and whose occurrence at the same time creates meaning for the person experiencing it. So, put in other words, it's a coincidence. Well, it's an unusual circumstance that we attribute to chance, because indeed what happens shows a convergence of events that have no causal link. So there it is a chance, but a chance that has meaning, and this meaning delivers both information, so it's information, and at the same time is accompanied by a strong emotion. That is to say, there are essentially two things that validate synchronicity in the presence of coincidence. On one hand, the strong improbability, and on the other hand, the emotion that accompanies the emergence of meaning.
That is to say, the person subjectively becomes aware that it is more than mere chance.
Here, that's it, and his mind doesn't have time to. There's the issue of projections. One can be mistaken. So to be sure it's a true synchronicity, the mind must not have interfered. That is, the person is impressed by, is moved by the meaning revealed by this event, and moreover, this event is very improbable. In this case, we are dealing with a true synchronicity. It is completely subjective, but it is something that requires a scientific explanation because it defies the laws of chance.
Some say it is a part of our human unconscious. That is, everything beneath consciousness, which might play a role, maybe tricking us too.
Yes, so when we seek the explanation, we realize there is indeed a connection between the unconscious and what happens. So it suggests that consciousness is creative. It suggests, by the way, it's true that what we have emotionally stored in their unconscious, because it is the unconscious that, let's say, will somehow program the future, but we will come back to that, because it is stable information. The more we prevent it from surfacing into consciousness, the more we feed it, and it eventually emerges into reality.
In the form of synchronicity in particular?
In the form of synchronicity, because the human being is creative, because consciousness is creative, but we will need to come back to this to explain why.
We can do it now if you want.
It's quite long. I do entire lectures on it because one needs to explain. It requires a change in the conception of reality in which space, time and matter are not fundamentals, but these are emerging phenomena linked to consciousness, which means it is important not to conceive everything that is about perception and everything that is real. The real is composed of information which we interpret in the form of a perspectival field that creates space, time, and matter. There you go. We must not confuse the perceptual field and the real. From there we can associate what we consider as space itself, the end, space-time, as being connected to consciousness, and the vibrations of this space-time are linked to the vibrations of consciousness. In this case, concerning our collective space, our collective space would be a creation of our collective consciousness.
And so reality, deep down, is an illusion.
Reality is an illusion in the sense that we should not add extra layers to our awareness of the real, and an additional reality that we do not need. I often say that we have, the real is made up, well, reality, that is to say the appearance of the real, is made up of three things. Objects, that is to say matter, the space which contains these objects, and the consciousness of the objects, and thus the space that contains these objects. In there is something unnecessary, which is space, because we do not need space from the moment we have the objects, and the consciousness of the objects, since it is the consciousness of the objects that constructs the space. And indeed, in physics, physicists destroy space.
And that is considered even in authorized mainstream physics. It is acknowledged.
It is considered very serious. It is known. Space, it is non-local, it is in vibration. It is perforated, it is pixelated in the infinitely small. It is curved. All the prerogatives of space disappear. And in addition, you have the holographic principle which is present in physics. I'm not saying it's proven because it concerns space beyond the horizon of black holes or even of the Big Bang. But there is something very powerful here that shows us that, yes, what physics says, that is a model that describes reality on a surface horizon of the universe, is equivalent to another model that describes the reality in volume, this time beyond this horizon. So it's quite impressive. And by the way, that brings out 5 additional vibrational dimensions, and it would even explain gravity. So it's very powerful. And the greatest physicists are fascinated by the holographic correspondence, so we cannot deny it.
But what exactly do you mean by that? For those who may not be familiar with these physical concepts, we will come back to synchronicities.
What I mean by that is there are many physical elements that show us that space is something emergent, just like time. Time, we already knew that. That is to say, physics is shouting at us. Physics is shouting at us that space and time do not have a fundamental existence. They are not the premises of reality. They are emerging things. It emerges from a more fundamental reality. And the more fundamental reality would be quantum. It would be multiple. It would be composed of quantum fields. And there would be a mechanism called the decoherence mechanism that constructs our apparent reality from this fundamental reality that is essentially multiple, that is essentially quantum.
Some might say spiritual, of a spiritual nature or consciousness.
Then, to move into spirituality, there is yet another step to take. This other step consists of explain why consciousness is creative. But well, already it is easier to explain once we have accepted the fact that space is not space, that space is linked to consciousness. And so now we also need to describe what space-time is. Space-time, then we can start from the block universe of the Einsteinian conception of space-time, which considers our future as already realized and our past as always there. whom this conception, it's a block universe, so it is static. It would mean that we are carried along in some sort of matrix and we can't change any detail of our life. Everything is already
Determined.
Everything is already determined. This is a concept that is incompatible with quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics seems to tell us almost the opposite, but if we try to reconcile the two, while maintaining the deterministic framework, we arrive at the famous theory of parallel universes or the multiverse, which results in the consequence that each of us would have myriads of alternative possibilities to live our lives. We would have billions, maybe billions of ways to conduct our own lives, but they would all exist in other universes completely separate from one another.
Who are therefore immaterial in this case?
No, they would be real. That's the concept. Determinism requires us to consider that I have myriad other lives simultaneously, but I make different choices in them. That is, in my opinion, ultimately a delusional concept.
That is to say, it is indeed difficult to make sense of it for ordinary consciousness.
Unless we consider that this multiverse actually exists, but that it is simply potentials, information, not lived experience. So there would be, moreover, physics invites us to consider this, because in the phenomenon of decoherence, which creates reality from a more fundamental real, this creation does not happen in time. It happens outside of time. I'm referring to the great French physicist Alain Connes, who tells us that the fundamental reality, well, reality is created in another time that he calls the angel's clock here below, or that he calls the divine clock's tick-tock instead. The tick-tock of the divine clock is another time in which the reality we will live is being prepared. What does that mean? It means that our future is being constructed before we get there. All right? And this future is multiple and therefore contains multiple potentials, a multiverse of potentialities, and we will live only one version. And something makes the multiverse of potentialities, initially quantum, perhaps in the distant future, transforms into a single reality. And so it is the phenomenon of decoherence, but that is not enough. It is the phenomenon of decoherence accompanied by the observer. That is to say, reality must be observed, and at that moment it becomes unique. That is to say, the observer has a role to play. Speaking of the observer implies the brain or consciousness. The problem is, if we say it's the brain, it would imply that our brain creates reality which doesn't hold up.
Why?
It's the paradox of ancestry. Paradox of ancestry. If reality needs brains to be created, we have a problem in the time when brains did not exist. There you go. It's better to call upon consciousness, provided that there are means to differentiate consciousness from the brain, and means to say that consciousness pre-existed the emergence of brains. And that makes sense from the moment the notion of space is questioned and space is attributed to consciousness, since of course space existed before the creation of brains. That means consciousness existed before the creation of brains. That is to say, consciousness is more fundamental than matter.
Which could be considered as a crystallization?
Matter could be considered a crystallization of consciousness. Consciousness would always be accompanied by a crystallization, and there would be consciousness at all scales of reality. There would be consciousness at the human scale, but also at the scale of our planet. We know our planet is a living being. No problem in deducing that it's a conscious being. It's almost a materialistic conception.
That's what Teilhard de Chardin said.
Exactly. Teilhard de Chardin's conception is perfectly justified today by physics. And also at the scale of cosmology, we might consider that the entire universe is a vast consciousness. And there are many elements, by the way, that support this idea. It's the fact that if we look at the whole universe, the arrangement of galaxies, the links between galaxies, I'm not quite sure what it's called anymore, that the universe itself would resemble a vast brain. And if we even get into quantifying from this matter, one is impressed by the analogical relationships between a brain and the universe itself.
Nevertheless, perhaps by a material brain.
Well, it wouldn't be a material brain. We say that, well, the difference between matter and consciousness is subtle.
It's a difference of level. That's what we were
I
saying.
often say, to summarize that, I say that matter is a sleeping, crystallized consciousness, and consciousness is an awakened matter. That is to say, to understand the difference between matter and consciousness, one must position oneself outside of time. If outside of time, I look at our reality, each of our lives, and there is nothing that moves, meaning that indeed there is not the slightest change in our lives. At that moment, everything is crystallized and there is no consciousness at work. Even if there is an incarnated consciousness that tries to, it might locally modify reality, but it always goes towards the same future. There is no consciousness at work. Consciousness at work would translate into the ability to weave space-time, that is, modify the timelines of each trajectory. And so then we have a future that at that moment evolves while it is swept by consciousness. And I think a good way to conceive reality is to say that our reality is matrix-like, as physics describes it. So this famous block universe. But this block universe is not static, it's dynamic. So let's recall what a block universe is. A block universe, we have 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time. Let's reduce the 3 dimensions of space to 2 dimensions. We thus create a disk, and we take the 3rd dimension to create time. So we can illustrate space-time, the block universe, with a cylinder. This cylinder would appear static from the outside. The work of consciousness would be to immerse itself in this cylinder at different times to modify the timelines. And at that moment, you have a cylinder that begins to change. You manage to change destiny. It is the work of consciousness to modify the destiny of each individual and of space-time itself.
Could you remind us of the quantum physics experiments that suggest the future will at some point solidify? As you mentioned before, it will suddenly be determined through the observer's perspective, actually.
So, in quantum mechanics, at the level of constructing reality, we have 2 elements. We have the theory of decoherence that allows a quantum reality of completely entangled timelines to transform into a set of separate timelines. That's the first thing. But the phenomenon of decoherence does not explain the choice that is made. And that makes us live one timeline or another. The phenomenon of decoherence explains the transformation from quantum ontology to classical ontology. But there remains a multiverse of possibilities, let's say 2 simply. And it is the observer who will determine the reality that will ultimately be experienced. So there are 2 stages. When I say the observer, it doesn't mean that it's their consciousness acting in the present. Because first of all, we know that we are all conditioned. and it could perfectly be the brain, but nevertheless, consciousness can perfectly act on the future of reality, which is quantum, because consciousness, if it is linked to space, it is not linked, the collective consciousness would be linked to the constructed space, once it is constructed, to the collective space, but each individual consciousness similarly would be linked to the void. In my books, I explain why consciousness and each individual consciousness must be associated with the vibrations of the void. And I demonstrated in my work at CNRS, in my publications in the journal Annals of Physics, that trajectories on a macroscopic level, like billiard balls, are ultimately very quickly determined by the information of the void, that is, by what we call quantum fluctuations on an infinitesimal scale. Let's recall what the Planck scale is. The Planck scale is something like 10 to the power of minus 35 meters, so 35 orders of magnitude below a meter.
It's very small indeed.
Infinitely small. We do not have instruments capable of measuring reality at this scale. In any case, we are dealing with quantum.
And so, we arrived there through mathematical equations, actually, through calculation, in any case.
Here, so I arrived through calculations to show that the trajectory of a ball on a billiard table, and ultimately I quantified the time after which it was determined by quantum fluctuations of space at the infinitesimal scale. I spent years working on it. I even showed after a certain time, which corresponds to 3 times the scale, 3 times 35, 10 to the power of negative 35, measured in number of collisions. On average, of course, reality becomes quantum, that is, the billiard becomes quantum. Well, one cannot observe a quantum billiards. I am speaking about the future. In the future, reality becomes quantum. The real is quantum. And we are at a level where it is the void that determines what is, and thus consciousness.
Because for you, indeed, as soon as we reach this void, it's consciousness that emerges, or at any rate is present behind, underlying.
That's it. That is to say, it's what's in our heads, it's our thoughts, our emotions, that configure the void, which had an effect on reality, configuring in the future the void that ultimately has an effect on creating reality. That is to say, let's imagine, there you go, our thoughts, our emotions, there you go, are directly influenced by the distant future. And there, at that moment, there is all thoughts, all emotions continue to circulate like that. But indefinitely in the void of reality, waiting to dive into reality. And this diving into reality happens in 2 phases. On one hand, the mechanism of decoherence that transforms all these entangled potentialities with each other into possible realities to live in. And finally, the observer will ultimately determine what it experiences. It may not necessarily determine it consciously. It could be its brain, etc. That said, consciousness has the capacity to choose in the present, because consciousness is not the brain, and because consciousness can be connected to a certain thickness of time, a certain density of time. That is to say, consciousness, I'll say it a bit quickly, is linked to a certain thickness of time in the future, whereas, in fact, concerning the brain can be considered as a kind of reading head that comes to read reality, already created in the future and obliges it to be unique. But this reading head, there is no information. If we want to model consciousness in the present, we have to call upon a certain thickness of time. We call this exposure time. But, well, if I want to model my consciousness of the present time, I will have to use a time window that has a thickness on the order of a second to be able to detect rapid movements, etc. And so the consciousness of a life can be modeled by a window of time that moves towards the future. Or better yet, we are in the window of time of the present and the future. It's the future coming toward us, there you go. And so we are simply observing the future entering the present within a certain window of time that allows us to be aware of what is happening. And since this window of time is not zero, since its thickness is not zero, if it were zero, we would not be conscious. In states of meditation, we can increase this thickness.
Is that something that can be demonstrated through calculation as well, or is it a deduction from the results we arrive at?
One can refer to Libet's experiments, which show that consciousness and the brain are out of sync, meaning consciousness lags behind the brain. In the old paradigm where we think that reality is created in time, that would mean that consciousness has no free will and that consciousness comes after brain activity. But in the new paradigm where the future already exists and where consciousness is ahead in the future, it is normal that if consciousness is ahead in the future, to be able to make choices. On an EEG recording, we notice the opposite, because the future, it enters the present afterward, okay? There you go. So, Libet's experiments were originally interpreted as experiments that showed the absence of free will. And to restore free will, it was necessary to invoke the notion of cancelling a decision, which is somewhat wobbly. Anyway, whereas there is no need, free will is demonstrated by Libet's experiment. From the moment we interpret it, in the new paradigm, where we attribute to consciousness a certain thickness of time. And there we clearly see that consciousness makes choices. That is, it is the fact of being aware of different possibilities, which leads us to make a choice. And this choice is not linked to a mental, analytical activity. Otherwise, we would fall back into the mechanics that impose a singular reality. So there, by definition, I impose that within this thickness of time, no choice can be made analytically. Otherwise, this choice would not exist. That is to say, situations persist. It's like we talked about artificial intelligence earlier. Artificial intelligence is not able to make choices unless we add an algorithm of control. But it becomes, at that moment, it becomes completely distorted and dangerous. Consciousness will make a choice that will not rely on an algorithm. It will not make a choice based on reasoning. It will make a vibrational choice. That is, I reiterate, the conditions are exactly the same from a mental point of view for a person who is afraid or for a person who is joyful. The person who is confident, let's say, will make a different choice than the person who has fear. That is to say, consciousness will serve for that. Consciousness will serve for that because we realize it well. Here, there is an exciting perspective. And there, let's say, there is a usual perspective. The person who is afraid will choose the usual perspective. The person who is confident knows they are taking a risk, but since they are confident, they will choose the exciting perspective. No AI can do that because it would require the AI to be conscious.
And to return to the synchronicities we were talking about at the beginning of this reasoning.
Now we can explain.
There you go. So, let's go precisely.
So now we can explain synchronicity. by saying that there might still be something more to explain. But, well, I will start to explain it. From the moment consciousness can have a grasp on the future, something we think about, a sort of obsession or a dream or etc., which will be translated into the unconscious by stable information. This information will thus be able to program the future, but in the void, not yet constituted, not yet, and it will result in increased probability of a timeline which will eventually emerge in the present. That is to say, what corresponds to the potential programmed, meaning that here we are, each of us has multiple potential life paths ahead that will not present themselves immediately. We have to wait for the bifurcations, like in billiards, for example. And so, you have a certain number of timelines from the future that can lead to a destination corresponding to a certain state of consciousness that will, if we increase their probability, seek to connect to our current timeline, which will result in coincidences manifested in life at moments when the probability will be increased. And this increase in probability will result in a coincidence that is something that will surprise us. So it will not change much in the universe that a cat crosses the road at one moment or another. That the universe can, there you go, quite simply, if there is a synchronous phenomenon, there you go, it will carry meaning. I'm just saying anything with the cat. Well, anyway.
Let's say that for each person, it is specific to their life journey and what they are seeking.
There will be anomalies that will appear in reality, which we will attribute to chance, which we can attribute to chance. But if it is really too improbable, or if it repeats, we can no longer attribute it to chance and must attribute it to a timeline that seeks to divert us toward a new future. So there we have the beginnings of an explanation for the phenomenon of synchronicity. Now we need to go further and explain how a new state of consciousness can be creative. Because we are trapped in a matrix of thought, ultimately. In fact, our states of consciousness, through our brain, are simply generated by reading the future to be lived. That is, let's imagine it's real, we are engaged in a reality that is already determined in the future. And so, this future can perfectly determine our states of consciousness through the brain.
That is to say, through the projections we can make.
There it is. That is to say, our brain, it strongly conditions us. That is to say, we are prisoners of a conditioning that is both mechanical and cerebral. There are three main sources of cerebral conditioning, or rather of consciousness itself. It's the belief system, judgments, and the ego. The ego, that is to say, the image of who we are, we don't want to leave it. And so that is to protect ourselves. The ego seeks to protect the idea it has of its personality. And then we have our judgments and beliefs. And all this fixes us in a reality we cannot change. And so, if we want to provoke a synchronicity, for a synchronicity to occur, there must be something else. There must be a state of consciousness, freed from conditioning, that appears. And that's where the soul comes in. It may need to be defined.
Yes, we will indeed come back to it right
That's
after.
where the soul comes in. That is, it's about connecting with what's deepest within oneself, connecting with one's soul, which will allow an unconditioned state of consciousness to emerge, one that truly corresponds to who we are. And at that moment, we will capture some information. And the more this information fills us with joy, the more it is proof that it comes from the soul, because the brain is not capable of creating joy. The brain, our brain conditioning can be a source of pleasure, but cannot be the source of this unconditional love, of this joy, which can appear at certain moments when we deeply connect with ourselves. And then it means we have captured new information, it means we have captured a new potential, and at that moment, if we maintain it in the form of faith, that is where faith comes in. Well, we potentiate a new future. And that's where the magic of existence appears. That is to say, everything falls into place in a way that ultimately allows us to fulfill this dream, this intention that brought us joy.
Concretely, it's true that in life this kind of situation can occur. I think everyone has experienced it when we decide to embark on a new exploration, in a new direction, in a new project. And then it often seems that as soon as we choose to go in a new direction, things present themselves to us that feed this.
Exactly. That's what we call a state of grace. The feeling that finally the universe was just waiting for this. It's
That we leap, that we take this risk, and at that moment, we feel like everything is working to help us, in help yourself, and heaven will help you. It's something that physics should be able to explain.
And what do you think of people who believe we have a life destiny? Some even speak of karma in Eastern traditions. What do you think of these? So, it's not necessarily always deterministic. Some think it is. But in any case, we must experience certain things because it's our destiny or our potential.
So, there are two types of destiny. There is the old destiny that conditions us, the timeline we are on, where we are imprisoned. So, we can call that karmic destiny if we want, why not? Because we would have something to learn. And as long as we haven't learned it, we won't be able to exit this timeline to branch off. And there would be another type of destiny, which would be what I call our new potential future. And so our purpose, therefore linked to the soul. That is to say, when we embark on this reality, at first we are on the old destiny. And maybe we need to learn a certain number of things. And at that moment, we begin to wake up, we connect to our soul, and from there, we can move toward our new destiny, right? That's the idea.
What would be the ultimate state of behavior of consciousness in relation to this?
The ultimate stage, I would say, is death. What exactly do you mean?
The most perfect state in which one can be related to being stuck in one direction or another.
The most perfect state, the one that will generate this state of grace, that will create this magic, which makes us automatically find the path that leads us to our destination, is when consciousness is completely deconditioned, when we are connected to ourselves, and we constantly feel the joy of existing, and are thereby in faith, and thus we are both in the happiness of being simply happy because we feel connected, because we are in that faith, and we automatically live the magic of the subsequent existence, meaning that synchronicities follow one another. One can read things that happen to certain Buddhist monks or to certain great masters.
Or Christian ecstasy.
Ecstasy is something else again, because it will not necessarily be in action. Here I am looking for, at the level of actions, of what is experienced, then we can delve into everything that belongs to the paranormal realm, but that involves taking yet another step,
Let's keep our feet on the ground.
All right, let's stay grounded. The phenomena of synchronicities, moreover, often occur in avalanches. One can experience an avalanche of synchronicities, meaning that coincidences follow one another.
And have you experienced that too
I
personally?
have experienced, yes, many. Like a lot of synchronicities, always in avalanches, whether numerical synchronicities or synchronicities with animals.
But it's difficult to describe them. It would almost take an entire interview for each synchronicity. So I refer to my books since I describe them in my books.
You were talking about the soul. Perhaps it's time to define what you mean by soul before we delve a bit more into this concept.
There are all sorts of definitions of the soul. I will try to give a different definition that can be linked to physics. The first definition that can be linked to physics while respecting the notion of the soul is the soul leaves the body, for example, after death, meaning that consciousness survives. That's the definition that involves identifying the soul and consciousness. And so the soul would be the consciousness that,
when we are alive, allows us to maintain the body, to reject the excess entropy.
because it is unexplained, the fact that living beings manage to stay alive while being extremely complex systems is something unexplained. It is totally unexplained. We must acknowledge it. Science does not know how to explain life.
That is to say, we clearly see that when a living being dies, the body decomposes. That's it. But what makes them stay together before death and able to...
That's consciousness. The fact that the body is alive, by what mechanism a body is alive, this is completely unexplained by science. And I really emphasize this point.
In materialist science, in any case, which is in...
There is no science that can explain that in any case. Otherwise, it is not considered scientific.
What do you think, for example, of the morphogenetic fields of Rupert Sheldrake?
It is not considered scientific, but it is interesting. Even my explanations are not necessarily considered scientific. I cannot prove what I say with an experimental method that will repeat the same observations every time we take the same measurements. As soon as consciousness intervenes, it becomes more complicated.
Maybe another method is needed.
There, it is not... the investigation of consciousness must be done by a method other than the scientific method. Science is limited by its method. We should be able to broaden the framework of science. And so I was saying earlier that a first definition of consciousness is to define it as the information system, which allows the rejection of excess entropy so that the body survives. And this information system is a quantum information system. One can explain why relying on a quantum information system actually enables survival. And so, who survives death? Because the quantum informations do not undergo the thermodynamic process of degradation. They do not experience the increase in entropy. That is the big difference between quantum ontology and classical ontology. Classical ontology, ordinary reality, is caught in time, and this leads to the systematic emergence of disorder. Whereas in quantum information, time is not yet created, and so it exists eternally. The first great scientist, probably the greatest scientist on the planet, Roger Penrose, already proposed last century his theory of quantum consciousness by linking consciousness to quantum information, and in particular to vibrational information, which at the level of the structure of space-time itself, he connected it to quantum gravity, to the quantum fluctuations of space, because at that scale, everything is quantum. That is to say, multiple. He worked with neuroscientist Stuart Hameroff And during the 2000s, they eventually highlighted,
thanks to work on microtubules in the brain, the existence of quantum vibrations in microtubules,
and thus what tends to support this theory, to substantiate this
theory. It's not only in microtubules that there would be quantum vibrations, but also in ion channels. Critics of this theory say it's not possible because the phenomenon of decoherence is extremely rapid and doesn't allow for the emergence of quantum states on a sufficiently macroscopic scale.
But the critics forget that consciousness is not made up of quantum states that persist at the moment of discovery, except that discovery does not suffice to reduce everything to a single reality. So we must not forget that consciousness is ahead into the future.
That's what we said before.
That is to say, consciousness is composed of an absolutely considerable sum of quantum states that is not limited to those remaining after decoherence. Consciousness is ahead in the future, so it is all the quantum information that is ahead in the future that corresponds to consciousness. Okay? So why was I saying that? Remind me why I was saying that.
So you were talking about Penrose's theory and then the detractors?
I start from Penrose's theory, and so I expand the theory of quantum consciousness to the fact that consciousness is not limited to what subsists as a quantum state. It is also the whole, it is also the quantum body. And I was saying that to explain the nature of what survives. The nature of what survives is linked to the entirety of the quantum information that is in this thickness of time and can be connected to what we call the aura, the chakras, etc. All these things that are in esotericism, but that will one day enter physics through the front door, when we realize that all that is called energetic information, magnetism, etc., in all the alternative therapies, what is called energetics, which is not energy in the physical sense, since here we work on a substrate that is that of consciousness. So we are dealing with the energy of qi. Do not confuse what is called the energy of qi, which you feel when practicing Tai Chi, for example. I don't know how to do it, but well. Do not confuse the energy of qi with physical energy. The energy of qi is the energy of consciousness. It is the quantum information precisely that allows our bodies to stay alive.
Many traditions speak of spirits that might inhabit this quantum state or state of consciousness.
We were on the definition of consciousness.
Of the soul, and indeed connected with consciousness.
That is the first possible definition, meaning where we identify the soul and consciousness. Here I just explained how physics could explain the survival of the soul in the sense of the survival of the embodied consciousness. But the soul can also be something else altogether, because it could also be, if we broaden the framework, the original consciousness that desired our incarnation into a physical body, and that remains, at least in part, because it may have multiple lives eventually, that remain, let's say, on the other side. So, what is this other side? Can physics instruct us about what we call the afterlife? Well, yes, there are different possibilities. We can identify the beyond with the void, quite simply the complete void, since the void is not empty. The void is made up of potential information, of energy, this famous energy of the void, which inevitably corresponds to information. We don't know what it is. So already we would have a possible first hypothesis for what the territory of the soul is, let's say. But there is also the possibility that consciousness is beyond the horizons of our universe, the soul. The horizons of our universe are the horizon of the Big Bang. Today, physicists no longer believe that our reality comes from a Big Bang, which was never a Big Bang, because everything is questioned at that level. Even the inflation that followed the Big Bang is questioned, and we are discussing more, considering precisely quantum gravity. That is ultimately something that equates to the information of consciousness. We are discussing more the fact that there might be another universe behind a pre-Big Bang. There you go. And the same goes for black holes. Black holes could lead to other universes, so there you have it. When I talk about the beyond, physics describes for us an afterlife or multiple afterlives, but they might all be connected. The afterlife beyond the horizon of black holes, the afterlife beyond the horizon of the Big Bang, which in my opinion is simply the same afterlife but at different scales. And we can even go down to the infinitely small, because in the infinitely small, in the void, we find the possibility that even myriads of wormholes could be created. Wormholes are...
What exactly is a wormhole?
A wormhole is, on a cosmological scale, it could be what links two black holes. So two event horizons in our universe could be connected by a wormhole, and on a quantum infinitesimal scale, it's what would explain the phenomenon of entanglement, or it's what propels. It's not really an explanation, it's what would propose a model equivalent to the model of entanglement. Because here it's hard to... What is entanglement? Entanglement is the fact that two events, two particles, two systems can remain connected regardless of their distance, even if it's light years apart. And when we make an observation on one, it will determine what we observe on the other.
That's indeed one of the foundations of quantum physics.
That's it. This is one of the fundamental aspects of quantum mechanics. And so we call this non-locality. These things that are separated actually function as if they are in the same place, and that we can model mathematically by introducing a wormhole. That's it. And so we have the same observations on a larger cosmological scale as we do on a smaller scale. And when we talk about the observations, cosmological observations on a large scale, by saying that two black holes can be connected by a wormhole, is by involving quantum gravity. And when we talk about the same thing in the infinitely small, it is still quantum gravity. And what is quantum gravity? It is the intimate vibrational structure of space-time. That is, it is the vibrational structure of consciousness. Okay? We need to stop thinking that our universe on a large scale is exactly as we perceive it. That is a reasoning error well identified by Bernardo Kastrup, who, in my opinion, is the greatest philosopher at present. Philosopher who does what every philosopher should do, that is, who stays connected to science, the progress of physics, and so on, and interprets correctly. So, Bernardo Kastrup, through his model of analytical idealism, provides us with absolutely fabulous arguments to demonstrate that we are in a confusion which is physicalism. And because of this confusion of physicalism or materialism, we confuse reality perceived with the fundamental reality. And it is this confusion that leads us to make a second mistake, which is to believe that consciousness is produced by the brain. Because believing that consciousness is produced by the brain would be like believing that consciousness is produced by the map, while it is fundamentally connected to the territory. So let's say Bernardo Kastrup explains this very well. I read a book called
the analytical consciousness in a few words, which I recommend to all our listeners, because it's worth reading this little book, as it explains very well, and well, it wouldn't be right to sum it up in one sentence.
But by the way, you mentioned that in the community of physicists, there were many debates today and possibly also questioning of old paradigms, but that, so your ideas, for example, how much are they being discussed today? I mean, how are you received within this community? Are there debates beyond?
Well, let's say that, well, I am fairly respected. I am respected because I have published in mainstream journals like Analysis of Physics, etc. And then I give lectures, and it would be easy for the academic system or a lab director to publish something on the web saying, don't listen to Guillemant, he's saying this, it's false, etc., etc. Well, I'm still waiting for it.
You're not really attacked in the end?
Not really attacked, of course. We always experience, must I do a lot of conferences. If I read the comments on the conferences, you will always have people who will, but with always this tendency to insult. You know, we call them trolls. Well, as soon as there's an insult, you feel there's a lack of argument. So I only experience this kind of thing at times. But generally, the public and even scientists are interested in my speech. I try to make it as sensible as possible. And then we must not forget that when we do popularization, well, in fact, it's vulgar popularization. That is to say, to be understood by the public, we tend to oversimplify a bit too much. The main argument that could be raised against me, which has been and is less so now, is the fact of saying that I generalize too much quantum ontology at the macroscopic scale. So I was often challenged on that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and beyond that, it was even forbidden to consider that quantum could be generalized at the macroscopic scale. Now today, other quite reputable physicists...
Which ones, for example?
I think of Lincoln, I've mentioned him before, but also Harvey Zweer and even all the great physicists, Marc Lequiseret, Carlo Rovelli, etc., understand that the fundamental reality is quantum, okay? So it can be generalized, it is generalizable to the macroscopic scale, except we have no proof. That is, it is theoretically generalizable, but we have no proof.
No calculation proof, you know.
There you go, that's it. But I am much less criticized now because I have published works to show why quantum can be generalized to the macroscopic scale. It is written in black and white in the discussions of my publications in Analysis of Physics. I explained that billiards, after a certain time, it reveals a multiverse of possibilities, and since everything is then saturated, information becomes quantum. That means billiard balls are everywhere at once. Of course, it's true, but in the future, because when it enters the present, there is only one reality. But billiards becomes quantum. It's not just billiards. There are also our bodies. There is also... There you go. And so, the ideas I put forward by saying that consciousness is quantum information at the macroscopic scale, but we don't detect it. Because it's present in the near future, they are fully supported by my publications. And so there you have it. I'm waiting for the detractors. I'm waiting for the publication from the Academy of Sciences that will say, warning, Philippe Guillemant, something. Because at that moment, I will respond. And I could highlight the fact that, be careful, the Academy of Sciences is wrong. So there you have it. Well, anyway, it's to answer to... So, in any case, I've been on the same line for almost 20 years now. Since I started writing in 2007, 2008. My first book came out in 2010. 15 years at least. And I won't budge. I stick to the same guiding principle, meaning I start from the upheaval of our conception of time
which doesn't come from me, which comes from physicists, mainly French. Many French physicists have written about that, about time, about the upheaval of time.
Etienne Klein talks about it, by the way.
Etienne Klein talks about it. Marc Lazier-Srey, Thibaut Damour, Carlo Rovelli, and others that I forget. In Switzerland, Antoine Suarez, Nicolas Gissin. I start from that to review our conception of space-time, to propose a solution to the fundamental problem of physics, which consists of reconciling quantum mechanics and relativity, obviously through a model that is intuitive because we cannot put it into an equation. That's the problem. When we try to put, or then, yes, because in fact, what I describe is a future that evolves exactly like the trajectory of a GPS can evolve by either changing the choices made in the present, in which case the GPS must recalculate, or directly changing the destination, in which case there is also a recalculation. That is to say, the universe, everything happens as if the future space-time is constantly recalculating the trajectory we will follow in the future. That's my model, that's how I simplify it. And that makes an impression. It's very powerful. And on this, I think I am hardly contestable because it's a path which will allow us to mathematize it, because we can already digitize it. We can already not put it into equations, but put it into the computer, this model, to make it work. That is, we can put this model in the computer to show how timelines can change. Simply, we don't yet have the computing power. I myself, for my billiard calculations, had to use very clever algorithms and extrapolations to show that in the future, billiards becomes quantum, because it's not yet calculable. We'll get there when we have real quantum computers.
Could artificial intelligence help with this kind of calculation?
Not the current artificial intelligence, but the artificial intelligence that might result from the use of quantum computers when they truly appear, but real ones, not the current ones from Google where we don't have much Q8 at that moment, yes. And then the outlines of what will result from it are still difficult to define in advance.
You were talking a bit about the state of time theory and how it was received within the physics community.
I think the theory of time that I propose, if we don't talk too much about consciousness initially and just focus on the theory of the flexible universe, that's published. The flexible universe, the space-time that can evolve in the future like the trajectory of a GPS, that can evolve in two ways, either in the present or in the future. That's respected. It's respected, it's published, it's in peer-reviewed journals, etc. That's respected. Then, the fact that I start from that model to move towards spirituality, that's a scientific conditioning that causes scientists not to like it. Scientists are conditioned to reject anything related to the soul and consciousness.
Because it is considered non-scientific or metaphysical?
Because it is considered dogmatically out of habit, I would even say both out of habit and dogma, to be contrary to science, to dare to mention the soul, to dare to speak even of consciousness. Consciousness, it changes. It is rejected without examination. Without examination, you can make publications, but in a field that is not mainstream. I myself am invited to. I have been invited to two types of conferences. Following my publications in Annals of Physics, I was invited to give talks at major physics conferences. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend because it was during the COVID period. And then I was invited, and I am still invited, to give lectures at other conferences where this time they will talk about consciousness, the conscience. And there, I went to one of those conferences a long time ago, but now we are
about something very interdisciplinary that is not really received by the mainstream, even less so by mainstream media, but I'm not sure it is very useful. It requires a lot of work. Is the game invading the candle? It's not by going to conferences that are perhaps perceived as a bit too marginal that I'm going to move things forward. I'm more of a mainstream physicist. It's not because I write books on consciousness that I am in mainstream physics. My publications, they're not in poorly perceived journals, they're in journals that are quite respectable. And so I think I need to stay on this path, otherwise I could be taken seriously. I am hardly taken seriously by many scientists because I lean towards spirituality.
Because perhaps you also put humans back at the center of research concerns.
There you have it, because I place humans at the center. And then because our science is not interdisciplinary, our science is compartmentalized. And interdisciplinarity has always been a pious wish. So you are not allowed to publish at the interface between fundamental physics, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. Because, by the way, I did it. So it's going to end up in a journal that is not a mainstream journal. I made such a publication. So it's an interdisciplinary publication. So they tell you. It cannot be the same person who intervenes at the level of neuroscience. First, I did not publish it alone. Then normally, when you make an interdisciplinary publication, you should not include equations in it, because the neuroscientist who reads it won't understand anything. So we don't put an equation. But from the moment you don't put an equation in a publication, it can't end up in a mainstream physics journal, for example, or in a mainstream journal, or they are rare. And there you go, and then you're a bit stuck. And then it ends up landing in a journal that will be less read, that will be less, well. But I did it. I did all that.
And what do you think of initiatives? For example, I'm thinking of the manifesto for post-materialist science about the works of Mario Beauregard. Do you think there is now a movement emerging that could sort of take, gain ground, move forward, and become a bit dominant?
Yes. I myself am a signatory of this manifesto. Well, maybe it's a bit laborious, but I think that little by little, yes, it is becoming significant. But, well, there is going to be a major transformation of the media in the future, because the media are completely devalued today because they made mistakes or lied to us about the COVID crisis. But also because of the emergence of artificial intelligence, which will challenge the work of journalists due to a whole bunch of factors. So, the profound upheaval we will experience in mainstream media will bring about the new media paradigm, where I am certain, 100% certain that my speech, well, everything I have written in my books will gradually be accepted, even if it will be criticized, of course. But in any case, I have great confidence in that.
Could you give us other examples of publications you have made that interested people might check out, besides your work on billiard balls?
Other examples of publications. I have made publications in fundamental physics, in 3 or 4. I published in the field of artificial intelligence about 20 years ago. I made many publications in neuroscience related to technological works. At the time when I was working on the brain, dizziness and balance disorders, but also the analysis of brain activity. I made quite a few publications at the time when I developed algorithms to calculate what is called the activation dimension.
which with the help of algorithms allows measuring the state of wakefulness, almost a state of consciousness. I even managed to discover that one can quantify the dream. We can size deep sleep, we can size intense brain activity, and have dimensions that vary between 4 and 10 or 11. There you go, which coincidentally corresponds to the dimensions of space-time. So quite a few publications in neurophysiology, quite a few publications in brain neurosciences related to dizziness and balance issues. A nice publication with work I did with Comex at the time when I created the company Euratech to market artificial vision tools. I also made some publications in that field.
Are they on your website?
Yes, there you go. And then interdisciplinary publications, 2 interdisciplinary publications directly related to what we're talking about. That is my model. And then 3 publications, including 2 in Annals of Physics, on the fundamental physics underlying all of this.
And what is the publication that you care about the most, aside from the one on billiard balls?
The publication that is closest to my heart is the one where what's it called again? A unique but flexible space-time could challenge multiverse theories. A unique but flexible space-time could challenge multiverse theories. The one I am most proud of. But I wanted to say something else. What was your question?
It was about your publication that seems the most emblematic of your work, or the one dearest to your heart.
I published on cybernetic time, cybernetic old time. I published a paper that waited years before being published because I struggled to get it through, where I link consciousness with quantum gravity.
That's what you were talking about earlier.
There you go. Quantum gravity consciousness could cause an atemporal evolution of space-time. That's what I was saying, meaning that the evolution of space-time outside of time from GPS trajectories is linked to quantum vibrations and quantum gravity. And this quantum gravity is related to consciousness. So a quantum gravitational consciousness could evolve space-time in an atemporal manner that is out of time. This publication, I should maybe try to update it a bit. Well, it's... I admit to having a certain weariness because I have made efforts for years to achieve bringing forth publications, but in the mainstream, so I'm not really motivated to improve it outside of the mainstream. Besides, anyway, I'm retired now since last year. The problem I face is, what is the right strategy? Is the right strategy to continue doing scientific work, which inevitably will require a lot of time and energy and will not necessarily succeed in the mainstream, in the public? Or is it not better to work directly on trying to continue giving lectures, writing books, because that's how I reach the most people. There you go. And anyway, it's not up to me to do all the work. I can't.
Today it is true that, this may be my last question. Today many people talk about quantum physics. It seems that sometimes everything revolves around quantum physics. Do you not also think that perhaps it somewhat detracts from genuine scientific physical research?
Yes, because the word quantum is used in every context. It becomes a synonym for magical. So the physicists, they are a bit fed up with it. It's getting on their nerves. And so as soon as someone talks about quantum in an alternative human field, etc., they think it's nonsense. They're not wrong, because there's abuse on both sides. In fact, there is an excessive rejection on the scientific side, and there is an excessive acceptance on the public side, alternative therapy, etc. We need to get out of this duality.
People need to start talking to each other again.
Yes, I try to position myself in the middle path. The middle path is not comfortable. That is to say, to disagree with the strict mainstream scientific trend and at the same time disagree with the spiritualist trend, etc., which allows things that I do not allow myself to stay in the middle to try. Well, sometimes it's good when it feels like one manages to touch both at the same time, but often it's not good because you feel rejected by both sides. But I have this play inscribed in this middle path.
Philippe Guillemant, we're reaching the end of this interview. So as you know, we usually end with an open floor for our guests. So if you have anything to add, go ahead.
So to conclude, I would say that today there is great disorder on the planet, both geopolitical, etc. We can interpret things in a geopolitical way by looking for social causes, etc. Elective war, we can refer to all that, to terrorism, to wokeism. We can refer to look for all sorts of things, and we will go around in circles, and we will end up being afraid and wondering what kind of world we live in. Or we can take a step back from all that and understand that this great disorder, this collapse, whether it is monetary or otherwise, is something that is directly connected, causally and synchronistically, to the great paradigm shift, which corresponds to the inevitable, necessary and positive collapse of the Western mind. Because we were mistaken about the nature of reality, for 3 or 4 centuries, the West has been mistaken about the nature of reality by trying to reduce everything to the mind through science initially, and it was good to go in that direction. And then through technology, etc., we forgot transcendence, we forgot the soul, we forgot the true nature of the human, to the point where today we maintain gross errors about both the nature of reality and the nature of the human being. And we do not know how to interpret major developments. We do not understand that humans are not limited to their brains, and that we do not understand that artificial intelligence is not intelligent. We do not understand that there is a fundamental aspect of the human being that is vibratory, connected more to the right brain, to intuition, which is the source of true intelligence and should be the source of decisions that need to be made. And so if we reach this great disorder and collapse, it's because of that. And so this collapse will have the virtue, it will teach us to rediscover the true nature of humans and the true nature of reality. That's it. And so we should be very optimistic about what happens, because in any case, it was necessary and inevitable. And I think that the people who position themselves in this new configuration, in this new paradigm, whether they go into spirituality or connect, well, people who have stayed in the human aspect, in this vision, will handle this collapse quite well, because they will not be affected by false values. Because everything that will collapse is the false values. The true values, those who are connected or those who have remained attached to the true values, will not experience this negatively. On the other hand, often those who have become accustomed to all these false values will experience it negatively from this false paradigm, stemming from this false understanding of the mind and the humor.
Philippe Guillemant, thank you for this interview.
Thank you.